Okay, so if you've ever taken a class with me, you know I speak very quickly. So I have like 300 slides for an hour. So I'm going to move like really, really fast. Okay, you with me? So fasten your seatbelts and drink your coffee. So if you were at my talk a couple of years ago at the alumni event when I talked about data science, I started my talk with the exact same slide. I talked about this guy, Billy Beane, right, who is sort of the founding father of this modern analytics movement in business. Now, of course, people were doing analytics before Billy Beane, but he really brought it to the attention of the ordinary business people through this book and this movie, right, which were all about how he transformed the Oakland Athletics from a team that was fairly mediocre to one that was actually at the top of the league. And he was able to do it without increasing the budget, right? What he was able to do was change the way they recruited the team. In other words, he changed the way they did HR, right? Because HR is all about recruiting, retention, learning, and development, right? And so he started purely with the recruitment part, which is identifying, who should be hired and identifying who should be gotten rid of. Okay, and that's really what HR, at least in part, is all about. Now, you may recall from the movie that there already had HR people in place before Billy Beane showed up. It was these people, right? The scouts. And the scouts, what they would do is identify, right, potential talent by referring back to their internal databases, right? So they had a database. In that database, they had records of previous players who had been either recruited or not recruited, and the performance characteristics of those players. And then there was some kind of like association going on in their head about the characteristics that correlated with the successful players and the characteristics that correlated with the unsuccessful players. And so then when a new player came in, they would look at him and say, oh yeah, this reminds me of a very successful player. We should recruit them, right? And so there's a famous scene in the audio is not playing, but there's a famous scene in there where they're discussing a prospect and they say, oh, that guy will never be a good baseball player because he has an ugly girlfriend, right? Now that's interesting, right? Like, is that really predictive? To my knowledge, they never did an A/B test. They never did any analytics. They never did a regression. They never did a decision tree. They never did any kind of science to back up this hypothesis. Instead, this guy just has some folk theorem, like, as he expressed it, ugly girlfriend means lack of confidence. Lack of confidence means bad baseball player, right? So folk theorem, maybe with a bit of data that he collected, in accordance with confirmation bias to back it up. And so what Billy Beane did is he brought in some statisticians. And what they did is they replaced this reliance on gut, on tradition, on intuition and experience with a reliance on hard facts and numbers. Okay? Now, what he was able to do was to outperform other teams that had similar HR budgets. He was able to compete with the New York Yankees and the Los Angeles Dodgers with a fraction of their HR budget. So I refer to this as HR alpha. So those of you who have a finance background, right, you understand what alpha is. It's not just outperforming the S&P 500, but outperforming a portfolio with similar beta, right? So in HR, it's not about getting performance out of your workers. It's about getting performance, right, out of a workforce that's comparable to a similar workforce that might be in another organization. Okay, and so this HR alpha is performance controlling for resources devoted to that performance. And so he basically acted like a hedge fund manager, like a long-short equity hedge fund manager, looking for underpriced players and buying them, identifying overpriced players and then selling them, right? Although it's, you can't really short a player, but what you can do is you can unload a player that's overpriced. Now, at the end of the day, he was doing what we now call data science. It's very, very basic. And all you have to do data science is compile a spreadsheet, right? You just need a bunch of rows and a bunch of columns. And in this case, right, and this is an example of a bank that's making a loan to an individual. They want to identify the characteristics of the potential borrower to see if they line up with borrowers that have defaulted in the past. So all you have to do is create a database of your historical customers, where every row corresponds to a customer, and every column corresponds to a feature of that customer. And then the final column corresponds to what we call the target feature, which is, did they default or not? Now, in the case of Billy Bean, every row would be an individual player. Every column would be a characteristic of that player, and perhaps the appearance of his girlfriend might be one of those columns. As far as I know, it's not prohibited under employment law to put that in. And then the final column would be, how did that player turn out? Did they turn out to be a good player, bad player, many runs, few runs, home runs, pitches, whatever? You put that in as your target feature. Okay, and then you just run the algorithms. Okay, and so all you're doing basically is what we call training and scoring. Training on your training data, which is your legacy data, your historical data, and then scoring the new individuals to figure out whether you should make a loan to them, whether you should show them an ad, right? Whether you should hire them into your organization. Okay, now that's simple data science. If you were at my talk last year on FinTech, I talked about kind of how data science has grown up, and we use data that comes in much more complex forms, right? And that involves the use of deep learning, right? And deep learning uses things like images or data that comes in other than numerical form, unstructured data. So when we're thinking about an algorithm that's distinguishing between a good player and a bad player, where the characteristics are much more complex, we need these more sophisticated tools, like identifying the difference between a cat and a dog. Your brain does it very easily. It took a long time for machines to learn how to replicate what's going on inside your brain. And so now that we've mastered this, there are so many occupations and tasks and professions that involve the use of decision making, right, which can be replaced with automation, which can be replaced with, right, these new software tools. So for instance, if we're trying to identify whether someone has cancer or not, right, by looking at images, it's no different from looking at pictures of cats and dogs. It's just about cancer, no cancer, no cancer, 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 no cancer, no cancer, right? So if we train on these doctors' diagnoses, we can then replace the doctors with the robots. And indeed, the robots do better than the doctors in most cases, right? They don't get tired, they don't get sick, they don't get hungry, okay? They work all night and they make fewer mistakes. And so we're seeing, right, these tasks that were normally performed by humans, they're now being replaced by robots, which is why HR now has to think about, right, not just managing people, but managing robots, right? It's your entire workforce that you have to think about, and your workforce, typically we have kind of procurement over here deciding on which machines to buy, then we have HR over here deciding what people to buy. That has to be done in an integrated fashion. That's one of the big changes that we're seeing. Okay, so these doctors, they don't just do diagnoses, they actually do surgeries. Well, it's really no different. Surgery is just a series of decisions, and we can train on the decisions the doctors make and then have the robots do those decisions, right? If it's purple, snip it. If it's red, don't snip it. Whatever, I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but I don't need to be, okay? And so that's why when we talk about autonomous driving, right, and all of these other jobs. Now, I think what's going to happen for these jobs, again, this is all about kind of managing our workforce of the future. Before we move to fully autonomous driving, we're going to go through an intermediate phase where perhaps the driving will take place remotely, right? So we'll have the autonomous trucks go from, edge of city to edge of city, and then once they get to the edge of the city, the human will take over the wheel, okay, to handle the more complex driving task. But there's no reason why that human needs to be in the truck. Instead, that human could be in an office somewhere. So the next step will be to turn truck driving into an office job. I think that is something that is going to happen in the next few years, right? We already have, right, drone pilots operating out of office buildings in Tampa. And there's actually a big controversy now about whether or not if you get carpal tunnel dropping bombs, right, whether you should get a Purple Heart, because you're injured in battle. I don't know. It's a real controversy, okay? All right, so what we're seeing is a movement from, right, manual tasks to automated tasks, but we're going through this intermediate stage, which we call, augmentation. Now, a lot of people who are doing automation, they're doing it kind of in a stupid way. This is what has anybody been to this place, Cafe X? Okay, this is automation theater. This is innovation theater. We see a lot of innovation theater here in the Bay Area. Okay, there is absolutely no reason why anybody in their right mind would design a coffee-making robot that used a human arm-like motion, right? Okay, we've had coffee vending machines for decades, and they don't need this kind of thing. Now, this is really how you do automation, right? So at the Amazon fulfillment center, right, they use these Kiva robots to go and fetch the products and bring them back to the human to pack them into, right, the boxes. And so, we are seeing automation take over almost all of the logistics and supply chain tasks within the distribution of stuff. And so this is all the kind of jobs that none of you with MBAs actually do. However, I would venture to guess that your jobs are actually more vulnerable to automation than that of some manual laborer, right? It's very hard to design a robot that can lay bricks. It's very easy to design a robot that can classify, right, people into different buckets. And so that's why we see that lawyers, see you later, lawyers. Okay, I have no sympathy. I'm a lawyer, but I have no sympathy for these lawyers, right? And software is now replacing the lawyers. And so we have the robo-lawyers. And then what about the bankers? Haha, they're next. Let's get rid of them, right? I mean, you're just looking at loans. Lend them money, don't lend them money. Lend them money, don't lend them money. Okay, we can automate that. We can get rid of that, okay? So we're seeing this happen in the world of finance as well, okay? And so it's my claim that, most of these manual jobs, auditors, get rid of them, right? Paper processor, bookkeepers, finance officer, Oracle estimates that these are 95% likely to be eliminated. CPA, forget about it, gone, see ya. We don't need you anymore. Okay, we got the robots and they earn a lot less. Great, fantastic. This is an example of finance, right? This is the old finance. This is the new finance. And so, what about HR? So, what are all the people doing in HR? Okay, HR is a lot of stuff like payroll. Do we need that? Do we need a human for that? I don't think so. Benefits administration, right? Recruiting, learning, performance, a lot of these tasks will be automated. There'll still be some other tasks that will require the human touch, obviously, right? But we will see these cost center functionalities disappear. And HR will be about, right, strategy, strategic workforce management, strategic skill development. Right? Understanding how you take the most valuable part of your business, which is your people, and get the most out of your people. That's what HR will do. HR will no longer, I remember when I proposed teaching an HR course, and this is based on a course I teach here at Haas. I remember proposing an HR course, and the universal, everyone on the faculty, everyone in the administration was like, HR? Like, that's the most boring thing on the planet. Because when you think HR, you think, okay, did you get your benefits? Here's a stack of paper, fill it out, right? Did you check the box? Okay, great. That's HR. But that's not what the HR of the future is, right? It's all about, right, human capital strategy. Okay, so software is eating the world, and what that means is that HR has to catch up and do things differently. So what about marketing? Now, when we talk about marketing, oh boy, the marketing people have figured this out. They're way ahead of HR, right? They use software for everything. So when we think about Target, right? Target has been using predictive analytics since 2012 to figure out what customers should be buying, right? They track the individual purchases, they track your browsing behavior, they track your search behavior, and then they surface up recommendations to you and say, here, buy this, use this, right? And they give you these recommendations, right? Again, it's all built on collaborative filtering. It's all built on data science, nearest neighbor algorithms, and so forth. It's extremely effective. And most of the things, in fact, 75% of the things you watch on Netflix come out of some recommendation that they provide. Right? Amazon, same thing. You get customized, individualized recommendation. When you open your Amazon page, you get a web page which is different from every other person on the planet. When you open up your HR page, your employee page, do you get a page that is completely different from every other person on the planet? I would guess no, okay? And so Netflix has figured out that you can't have these crude buckets. One for executives, one for line workers. No, you need to segment down to the individual. So much so that not only do they recommend different movies to different people, but when they recommend the same movie, they use different pictures because they know that based on your personality type, if you're a horror movie lover, you're going to respond to this. If you are a vampire movie lover, you're going to respond to this, etc. I don't know if you're into kids movies, you watch, you get that, right? Okay, it's customized to you. I mean, Trump knew this too, but that's a different question. So companies understand this. Look at this is Salesforce's onboarding, right? When you go to Salesforce as an employee and you open up your beginning, day one, anybody here work at Salesforce? Day one, you do your onboarding. Your onboarding is designed for you, okay? And as you walk through your job, you get different recommendations of what it is that you should learn at what points in time, right? They don't assume that everybody's the same job. They don't assume that everybody has the same skill set. Everybody gets a customized onboarding, right? And this is run by HR. And so who runs the HR at Salesforce? Marketing people, right? Marketing people, HR people. They're the same people with the same skill sets. So in my class on data science, when I talk about data science for marketing, I say there's only 10 commandments in marketing. There's 10 commandments in your business, and they're on the tablets right there. And they boil down to the one thing: know your customer. That's it. You've got to know your customer if you want to service your customer. So who's your customer? This is a question I pose every time I talk to a business. I say, who's your customer? And they're like, well, you know, it's the person who's buying the product. And I'm like, no. Anyone you touch. And Uber has really brought this to our attention. I mean, we should have been thinking about it decades earlier. But when you go to Uber's website, right, this is what you see. Who's Uber's customer? Drivers and riders. They're both customers. It's not just the folks that provide the top line, it's all the other lines. They're all customers. Okay? So, what about your employees? Are your employees customers? Damn right they're customers, right? And you have to treat them like customers. And everything that the marketing folks have been doing for customers, you need to flip on its head and you need to start doing with your employees. In fact, in today's world, your employees are going to leave you before your customers. Right? In the old days, like General Motors, you hire someone at 18, you keep them until 60, give them a pension, right? And then your real problem is how do you get that customer to come back and buy next year's GM and not defect to Ford, right? In today's world, you're not worried someone's going to stop using Facebook. You're worried that your developer is going to quit. And the average life expectancy of an engineer here in Silicon Valley is 13 months. Right? In China, it's 6 months. Okay? So you have to devote enormous energy to recruiting and retaining these people because they are fickle and they will leave you, right? Unlike your customers. So your marketing efforts should be focused on them, not on the people using the product, so to speak. So I say, take this same exact imperative and apply it to employees. And in your HR department, hire marketing people. Don't hire HR people. Okay? So there's this thing that we learned about back in business school. Maybe you did. I learned it like 30 years ago. It was called scientific management. This guy, Frederick Taylor, created it. It was all about going down to the workforce, go down to the shop floor, and study these workers to figure out how you can get more out of them, right? And so they used time motion studies. People on the assembly line, and they're, you know, cranking, they're turning the crank, and they're like, okay, and then you'd be like, click, okay. And then they would see, okay, what if you turn the crank faster? What if we reorganize the shop floor? How can we get more output out of these workers? So I remember learning all about this. And we would say in operations class. I mean, in your operations class, you probably learned about cranberries, right? I don't know when you took the class. If you took it last year, you learned about cranberries. Took it 100 years ago, you learned about cranberries. I learned about cranberries in 1990, right? Anybody remember that? I mean, okay, and that's really all built on scientific management from the 1920s. But that's not where anybody worked. Anybody here worked there? I worked in a factory when I was like 12. I worked in a restaurant when I was 18. I worked in retail when I was like 21. But I haven't worked in those environments in a long time. Right? This is where we work. Right? We all work in places like this. But this is also a factory. Okay? It's just cranking out software. It's not cranking out stuff, right? So how can we take this philosophy of scientific management and apply it to this workplace? In other words, how can we use data, evidence, science, experimentation to figure out how do we get the most out of our workforce, right? What do we need to do? Now, I bet you can guess that a lot of this is going to have to do with things like engagement, and happiness, and workplace satisfaction, and so forth. And I'm going to show you that it does. And this is not all gushy, soft, fuzzy words. These are things which are drivers of performance, and we'll talk about it. So just before I get into that, I want to mention that this is becoming a huge business. So a couple friends of mine started a company back in 2007, and that company was all about how do you figure out how to extend the life expectancy of a typical unskilled worker, moderately skilled worker, like a call center employee. If you have a call center employee that quits after 6 months, then you've just spent a month recruiting them, a month training them, they quit after 6 months. What if you could get them to stay on the job for 12 months? What would you need to do in order to make that happen? You just do some Billy Bean stuff, right? You go out and you look at your historical data and you figure out, right, which ones quit after 6 months, which ones quit after 1 month, which ones quit after 12 months. You identify the characteristics of the ones that stick around longer and you recruit them. It's very, very simple. Okay, it's scientific, it's evidence-based, and it works. And so not only on the recruitment, but also on everything else. So this is the life cycle of an employee, right? We hire people. How do we hire people? Well, that person looks pretty good. Let's bring them in, I remember when I was recruiting, they told me, hey, if you're going to interview at Lehman, tell them you like lacrosse. I'm like, all right. Lacrosse, way to go. I love it, You hit people on the head with these sticks, and they're like, no, you don't know anything about lacrosse. Get out of here, right? So, not a very scientific method, okay? Conventional wisdom. Okay, then what about development, right? How do we figure out how to reskill, upskill our employees? Well, let's throw them to this leadership training program over at Haas, right? Or whatever, I don't know. I mean, do we know if it works? Have we done an analytics on it, right? And then, with respect to promotion, who do you promote? Well, this person's doing a great job, they play golf with me. Boom, let's promote them, okay? And then what about when they leave? Or how do you fire people? Who do you decide to get rid of? And then the people who do leave, right, why do they leave? Again, you have a bunch of exit interviews maybe where people tell you all sorts of nonsense. It's not scientific, right? So every single stage of this process is generating data. And that data is typically unexamined. Okay? Or it could be generating data, but you fail to capture that data. And so you can't do analytics. If you collect data at every stage in the way, and then you go back and analyze it, then you can improve every single piece of this process. So just think about applications, right? When people apply for a job, what happens? They send in these stupid things called resumes. Right? And then people go through the whole stack, and you have a massive stack. And so you're like, well, okay, I got to simplify my jobs. Anybody who didn't go to this school or that school, just get rid of them. Anybody who didn't have a GPA, get rid of them. Anybody who doesn't have 8 years of experience, get rid of them, right? And you use these rules of thumb to try and narrow down who you're going to employ, right? And so there's an easy way to kind of do a better job, which is to just take all your HR data, as I mentioned, throw it into a big database, and then just run some analytics on it to figure out like who does a good job, who does a bad job. Now, of course, you need to have some objective measure of good or bad, and that's going to be a problem potentially. But at least you're beginning to do something that's more data-driven. And so when my friends did created this company, they found all sorts of things that were counterintuitive for the workforce. So for instance, they interviewed HR managers who said, oh, we don't like job hoppers. They're going to quit. In other words, they look at the CV, and if you had 5 jobs, in the last 10 years, then you suck. Don't hire them. Turned out not to be predictive. They also thought things like, oh, if you didn't have a job for like 2 years, big gap on your resume, well, that's no good. That also turned out not to be predictive at all. They told me they went to India and they interviewed this guy who was head of a gigantic call center, and the guy said, oh, yeah, single women, don't hire them. They'll quit as soon as they get married. They looked at the data. The women stayed on longer than the men. So they went to this guy and said, look, the women quit before, stay on longer than the men. He said, get out of my office. You guys don't know anything about India, right? It's like the data. And so what happens with a lot of people is that, when their opinion encounters the data, their opinion wins. And people like that are the dinosaurs of business. You got to get rid of those people because they're standing in the way of data-driven decision making. Okay? And so another cool thing, and this is crazy, but one of the most important features in predicting whether someone would make a good employee, can you guess what it was? What type of browser did they use to apply for the job? I'm serious. Like, and if you know what the worst one is? Explorer. Don't hire anybody who uses Explorer. Just forget it. Like, just right off the bat, they suck. Okay. No, I mean, it's one feature out of many. But the crazy thing is, like, no one would have thought of that, right? You could interview 50 industrial psychologists and no one would say, make sure you check the browser, right? It just pops out of the data, right? It was just a feature that was left in there. Okay, other things they found out, right? Long-term unemployed make great hires. Military people make great hires. In fact, criminals make great hires. And so they went to one of these recruiters for one of these big call centers and they showed them this and they said, hey, you know, criminals make great hires. They're like, really? Where do we get more criminals? That's the kind of HR manager you want, right? They set up recruiting outside the jail. Hey, come work for us, right? You know, because they stayed on the job longer. The other thing they found, which was super cool, is you could predict toxicity ahead of time, right? Sexual harassers, embezzlers, alcoholics, this kind of thing. You can predict, well, that might be ADA, I don't know, but there's a couple things that you can predict, right, before they get on the job, and it'll save you a lot of trouble because once they get hired into the job, if they're toxic, then people start quitting all around them, right? And that costs you a fortune. And by the time you identify that, it's too late. Okay, so we can just do some basic analytics on our historical data and figure out what are the characteristics that correlate with toxicity. All right, I'll just give you one example of how workforce science is changing things like recruiting. So all of you are involved in recruiting, I'm sure, and you do a bunch of things to figure out, you know, whether someone's going to be a good employee. Of all these different things, which one do you think is the most predictive or the least predictive? Which one do you think is the most predictive? Cognitive ability? Unstructured interviews are the worst, right? Because what happens when you have an unstructured interview? You say, come on, hey, how's it going? Like, hey, I was doing pretty good. How you doing? Oh, wow, is that a picture of your child? Oh, he's so cute, right? Blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh, man, the Warriors, oh, yeah. And then before you know it, you're like, I love this person, right? Great, you know? Especially if they do things like mimicry, like if you go like this, and they go like, it's all subconscious, right? People are good at this stuff, okay? So also what happens with this is what's called homophily. Homophily means you hire people that are like you know? And if you're a certain type of person, you hire a certain type of person, great. It doesn't, you know, tease out the people that are higher quality. Okay, so it turns out that work samples, that's the best. You know, if you want to find out if somebody's good at catching a football, have them catch a football. Don't ask them their favorite color, okay? It's the best way to do it, all right? Cognitive ability is also really good. Now, this is for a subset of jobs, obviously, right? But just general cognitive ability, smart people tend to do better in a lot of these jobs. If you're going to do interviews, do it in a structured way. My colleague Don Moore has done a ton of work on this. He found that when companies do interviews, all it does is increase the average height and average attractiveness of the workforce. It does not improve the quality, unless that's your definition of, if you're a modeling agency, go for it, do an interview. Otherwise, don't even bother with the interview potentially.
Why is different sexual?
Because people lie. Like, have you ever heard of pass the trash? So like if you're a hospital and you have a surgeon who's like killing people, right? He's just cutting people open, leaving sponges in.
Right? All right. Maui was great. Yeah.
Completely unreliable, because if you give a bad reference, you might get sued. So you give them a great reference, just say, I'm going to give you an amazing reference as long as you get the hell out of here, okay? So what about promotion? So, you know, Google has something called the People Ops group, okay? They don't call it HR, they call it People Operations, right? Because it's scientific management. You know, you're trying to get the job done, and people are your raw materials, they're your ingredients. And so they did a lot of introspection, they hired a lot of PhDs, and they tried to figure out what makes for a successful leader in Google. Google initially tried to replace, they had a very complicated interviewing process. They had like 8 interviews per hire. And they said, this is crazy, right? Why are we spending so much time and resources doing interviews? Why don't we just look at our end output of all these interviews over the last couple of years and then just reproduce it with an algorithm? And that's what they did for a lot, you know, for some of the time, and it worked pretty darn well. I mean, it's not necessarily that it did a great job of hiring, it just replicated what they were already doing at a much lower cost. Okay, so oftentimes you have bias built in, no doubt, but the question is it better or worse than the alternative, which is humans? And algorithms can learn better than humans can. And that's why once you replace the humans with the algorithm can actually improve over time in a systematic way, as long as you capture the right target features. Okay, and so anyway, when you read all this stuff, a lot of it's very, very, I mean, you can make the slides available to you. It's very, very sensible stuff. Now, this is the problem of bias, right? So what if you're trying to figure out which employees are most likely to succeed in my organization? And how you define success as positive performance reviews. Is that a good way? Well, it depends, right? Are those positive performance reviews themselves biased? If they're biased, then you replicate them, then you're just going to replicate the bias, right? So if you, for instance, only pull over people of a particular ethnicity, if you're a cop, and it turns out, whoa, lo and behold, you know, they have drugs in their trunk or something, then the model's going to say, go pull over those sorts of people, because there's bias in your training data, okay? So if you have biased training data, or if you have a biased, right, way of classifying, and then you replicate it, okay, it doesn't really do you a whole lot of good. Now, this is an example. Amazon, they decided to recruit using AI. And so they just started zapping out all of these help wanted ads in people's news feeds and stuff. And it turned out that they were only sending them to men instead of women. And so what was happening here? They were only getting male applicants, and they're like, this is weird. And then they found out that they were only buying ads in male news feeds. Now, is this because the training data was biased? Turns out actually it wasn't. Most people think it was. It wasn't because the training data was biased. They had plenty of successful female employees. You know what the problem was? They were optimizing, right? They were optimizing clicks per dollar, conversions per dollar. And it cost more to advertise to a female customer than a male customer, because females have higher conversion rates on consumer goods. And so you have to bid against the consumer good companies when you're buying airtime in someone's news feed. And so instead of optimizing on conversion per impression, they were optimizing on conversion per dollar, and so they only sent ads to men. So if you don't understand like what you're doing, you're likely to make a lot of big mistakes. This is another example, right? So this is a company called Textio, really interesting startup. And what they do is they've determined that different types of help wanted ads recruit different types of people. So if you're like, hey, come work here and kick some ass, you know, be like a data ninja. Okay, it turns out like women are like, I'm not applying for that job, right? But the men are like, oh yeah, let's do it, yeah, ninja, yeah, I want to be a ninja, right? Okay, and so maybe the person who authored this ad is completely unaware of the fact that this is going to have a differential impact on who fills out the response and who clicks and converts. And so what Textio does is as you start typing the ad, they start telling you, hey, that word is going to bring in more women, that word is going to bring in more men, that word is going to bring in people that are more analytical, this is going to bring in lower quality people, right, based on historical data. Just changing the words can have how much does it cost to change words? 0. Okay, so the ROI on this is huge. Okay, so look, whether it's recruiting, onboarding, connecting, learning, performance, compensation, succession, every single aspect of the HR value chain can be improved, right, with the use of workforce science. Okay, and so workforce science is toppling workforce myths, right? Why do people leave? Again, HR managers, they don't get it right. Typically, it's because you have a crappy boss. Okay, typically it's because, and yet everybody thinks, oh, we just got to pay them more money, or we got to we got to change the working conditions, do some of the things we're going to talk about later, like give them more lighting. Well, if you don't fix the boss, then none of that stuff is going to work. Okay, now how do you know this? Do you do it because of exit interviews? Someone says, yeah, I'm leaving because my boss sucks. No, nobody says that in the exit interview. But if you put in a control for a boss, you see there's massive variation in attrition across bosses within the same functional group. And so you can take that analytics, go up one step and say, what are the characteristics that make for a good boss, that lead to good retention? So the whole point of this, and this is just sort of the first half of the talk, again, this is all based on a course that I teach to the MBAs, I've been doing now for 5 years. And that is, if you understand marketing analytics, and most people understand marketing analytics, there's this thing called the sales funnel. And every single step of that funnel, there are, performance metrics, conversion, awareness, et cetera. Okay? And I want to argue that there's a recruiting funnel. And the same tools that people have been using in marketing analytics, you just map on over to the recruiting funnel. Again, conversion, awareness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a transition there's like a Markov process, that you can map out between each of these steps and then figure out how to tweak each one of them to increase, right, the amount of stuff that's going through this funnel. If you understand anything about churn models are all typically around customers. Like, how do you prevent someone from switching from AT&T to T-Mobile, right? And then blah, 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 and what do you do? And how do you predict it? How do you intervene? How do you change it? How do you reduce it? Well, guess what? There's employee churn models too. Same exact mathematical models trying to do the same exact thing. Prevent people from quitting Facebook and going to work for Google or working for Salesforce or working for the startup, okay? Then we talk about the customer journey map. If you've ever gone through a design thinking class, it's all about the customer journey map. Customer comes in, they start using the product, blah, 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 and then they get frustrated and so forth. Well, if your design thinking class did not include an employee journey map, then you were robbed, right? Because this is also important. And so understanding the pain points of the employee. Most HR people don't understand that. They're like, here's a stack of paperwork, fill it out. It's like, are you kidding me? You think Facebook would say, here's a stack of stuff before you can use your news feed, fill it out? No, okay? And then we know about CAC, right? Customer acquisition cost. If you don't know about this, then you've been under a rock for the last 50 years. I'm so glad you decided to emerge and come to an alumni event. But it's, how much does it cost to get a customer signed up? Okay, well, guess what? There's an employee acquisition cost too. How much does it cost to get an employee in the door? These are metrics. These are numbers that your HR department has to know. When you get back from this talk, call your head of HR and say, hey, what's our employee acquisition cost? And if they say, I don't know, fire them. Okay? We've got this thing called customer lifetime value, right? So this is the value of the customer. It's the integral of that whole thing. And so you know if you lose the customer, what you lose. You also know that if you want to improve customer lifetime value, you've got to adjust these different dials. Guess what? We've got employee lifetime value. Okay? And so if you want to maximize employee lifetime value, you've got to think about, okay, how do we, right, reduce employee acquisition cost? How do we accelerate onboarding? Like, if you take 6 months to create a productive employee, okay, and they quit after 7 months, okay, that's not good. You got to have them be productive within 48 hours of arriving on the job. Okay, then, okay, if they quit early instead of late, well, that's not good. You're losing a bunch of value. And then, you want to enhance their productivity while they're on the job. Okay, and that's going to be a lot of what we're going to talk about in the second half of this. Okay, and so there's a whole landscape of startups that are trying to solve each one of these little problems. Okay, so you've seen the MarTech picture. This is the HR tech picture. And there's tons of VC investment flowing into HR tech. I'm surprised there's been so little, actually, because people, again, is the most valuable part of your business. Okay, so remember we talked about, right, we talked about scientific management, okay, and how it's all about going down onto the shop floor to figure out what's going on to increase productivity. How do you go down to that shop floor like Facebook or Google and figure out what these people are doing every day and how to make them better at it? How do you do it? What about some cameras? Okay? I'm serious. Like, how about some cameras? Let's figure out what's going on. Let's take a look at them, right? Or what about beacons? Because beacons, we use them in retail. So look, again, the marketing people are so far ahead because marketing people have budget that HR people don't. So marketing people have figured out, hey, if we want to figure out what's going on in Safeway or Walmart or The Gap, let's follow people around the store with their phones as they browse and shop, right? So that we can replicate what we're already doing on the websites, okay? And because your phones generate so much data in retail, we can figure out like what aisles are people going down, right? Are they going to get the beer after they get the diapers and that sort of thing, right? This is actually, and there's tons of startups in this space. I've done a lot of work with retailers on this kind of stuff. We can break it down by demographics, right? The males go here, the females go there, the old people go there, the rich people go there, and so forth, right? Starbucks does this. If you were here 2 years ago, we talked about this. You go to Starbucks, as soon as you walk in, they know that you're standing there trying to figure out what coffee to order. They know how long you're in line. They know how long you wait for your coffee. They know how long you are in their bathrooms because you bring your phone with you, okay? And they have beacons all throughout the store. Now, what do they do with all this data? What do they do with it all? Well, one of the things they do is they actually tie it into their HR systems so they can figure out staffing for each of these stores. How many people do you need making coffee? How many people do you need working the cash registers? How many people and how often do they need to go and clean the bathrooms, right? So you tie it into, right, your HR systems. So now no longer do you need a human that says, oh, I need 3 workers on Wednesday and 4 on Thursday. It just automatically sends out the work schedule to those employees. In fact, if you're sitting there making coffee and there's a big line in the cash register, you can get a text that says, stop making coffee, go over and man the cash register. Okay? You don't need a store manager standing there and go, that line's longer than that line, right? There's somebody back at some cloud, system in Seattle that's figuring this out, okay? And so we now have all these tools like Slack, and this is Crew. It's a Slack for service workers that we can use to kind of track, all the communications between our workers and so on. And then we can track our staffing with our stores. We can then track what's happening in the stores with the customers, with the employees. We can do our inventory management. Oh, this was my worst job ever. Was going up and down the aisles, counting the boxes of Bisquick to see if there was any, shrinkage. That was terrible. But we can now, we can actually measure the productivity of our staff. Like if I spent, so in marketing we have attribution as an issue, right? And we're trying to figure out which advertising channel leads to sales and conversion. What about physical stores? You have a staffer that goes up. I mean, you go to Levi's store and someone spends 20 minutes talking to you about jeans. Then they get distracted by another customer, and then some other employee comes in and goes, hey, John, let's go to the cash register right now. And then boom, they get credit for the sale. Okay, if you're tracking your employees, you can say, hey, she spent 20 minutes talking to the customer, he spent 1 minute swooping down. And if you have a last touch attribution model on face-to-face sales, he's going to get the credit. If you track it, she'll get the credit. Okay? And so you can really enhance the in-person employee experience if you give them tools that help them to do their job better. Now, again, if you were here a couple years ago, I talked about UPS and how they track all of their employees because they have instrumented trucks, right? And they're connected to the internet at all times, okay? And you can tell when the driver is backing up, when they're not wearing their seatbelt. And then you can reprimand them or give them education or text them and say, yo, fasten your seatbelt. Or even make it so that the truck won't start if they don't fasten their seatbelt. And so we're starting to, remember, instrument and measure and monitor everything that happens in your employment life, right? Just like everything that happens in your consumer life is being monitored, right? Again, we talk about baseball, right? Soccer, basketball. All these players are now wearing RFIDs, GPS chips. We can use them to not only design better strategy, but to do preventative maintenance on hamstrings, okay? Which is one of the biggest problems with athletes. And so in addition to monitoring the physical activity of our employees, we can monitor the virtual or digital activity of our employees. So, typical way to do this is to look at what we call network diagrams. So, if we look at org charts, this is a classic org chart, and Google has an org chart on the phone. You can see where you are on the org chart. We're going to look at a guy like Mitchell here, and Mitchell is going to look like a relatively unimportant person in this org chart, right? But if we actually look at the email interactions of these employees, we draw up a network diagram, we see that Mitchell's really important. Mitchell is actually serving as a bridge to connect all these people. Mitchell is kind of educating other employees. Now, on the performance measurements, Mitchell might not do so well, right? Because the standard performance measurements are how many units did you sell? But if you're spending half your time teaching other people how to sell, it's not going to show up in the traditional accounts, but we can check with the email. Okay, now maybe it's March Madness and this guy's just taking bets. I don't know. You'd have to look at the content of the email if you want to figure that out. But look, this reveals things, and it's very easy to do. You can get software that does this within your company. And we can figure out whether an employee is a connector, right? Whether they're communicating. We can actually predict whether they're going to quit based on how they interact with their fellow employees. Okay? This is a really cool book called Adaptive Space. I had him speak in my class this week. And what he did, he worked at General Motors, as VP of People. Now he's at AWS. And what he used these network diagrams to figure out how do you make a company more innovative, right? How do you identify, right, pathologies in the way that people are interacting, and then do tweaks to make sure that they interact in a productive way. And what he identified was that people tend to cluster in these different departments and divisions, and then there are these people called brokers who tend to arbitrage across these different departments and divisions. Okay, so what happens when a big, lumbering, bureaucratic organization like General Motors goes out and acquires an innovative company like Cruise Automation, what happens typically? They squish it, they squash it, they crush it, they make everyone at Cruise miserable, they all quit, and they just wasted $2 billion. That's typically what happens. How do you prevent that? How do you prevent that? What you want is some way for these innovative pieces, these outposts that we all know about here in Silicon Valley, to communicate back with the mothership so that the ideas can move upstream. How do you do it? You need these connectors. So this is actual data from a financial services acquisition, a successful financial services acquisition. And you can track, this is all email communications. You can track what's happening over time. And when this acquisition first took place, 6 months after the acquisition, the only connectors were the people who were on the integration team. Now, if you're on the integration team and you're not connecting, well, I don't know what you're doing, right? And so just looking at this, we would say, hey, this is, nothing's happening here. 6 months after that, see this, okay? And what this tells you is that this is a successful integration, because those innovative people are now embedded within the organization. Okay? And so remember, mergers are very difficult. How do you do it? So when GM actually acquired Cruise Automation, they took the VP of engineering that was the most central person, the person who had the most kind of spokes radiating out from him, the most important person in the mother organization, said, all right, your job is to protect Cruise Automation and make sure it doesn't get crushed. You are our bridge person. Okay, that's your job. You're the bridge person. Precisely because you're the most connected person, you're going to make this work. Okay, so I think of that person as the placenta that protects the baby from the mother's immune system, right? Right, because typically that's what would happen without a placenta is the immune system would just, kill the baby. Okay, and so we can do these, and so I think the most innovative company on the planet, the most well-run company on the planet, you know what it is? In my view, Amazon. No, Amazon. Microsoft's getting there, but Amazon, I think. And what Amazon does is they break down everything into these two pizza teams, but these two pizza teams are all connected because of APIs. And again, it's a whole nother conversation, but if you look at their network diagram, it's really kind of a thing of beauty. Okay, this is an actual network diagram of Amazon, where every single team is connected to other teams, and these teams are continually in constant, reconfiguration mode. Okay, really, really cool stuff. Okay, that's Amazon. That's a real diagram of Amazon based on their emails. Okay, so again, you can diagnose organizations, again, just by looking at these communications. You can also look at what people are doing on their computers, right? Now, why would you want to do this? Figure out how much time they spend on ESPN? Maybe. Or figure out, hey, if somebody's spending an hour doing an expense report, that's a problem. You can figure that out. Okay, you can also track bricks and mortar movement, because a lot of times those interactions don't take place, through email. Sometimes people are walking down the hall and talk to people at the water cooler. You can track that with beacons. Okay? Amazon does this. They track all of their workers in the fulfillment centers. They all wear Fitbits, so they can track where they are and what they're doing for safety reasons, for productivity reasons, and they also fire you if you're not productive enough, and they can track that from your Fitbit. Okay? Maybe you stick the Fitbit in your buddy's pocket and go have a drink. I don't know. There's ways to game it. Okay? Right? But we can take the physical information plus the email information and draw out all sorts of inferences. So this is a former student of mine. He has a startup, and what they're doing is they're tracking software development process by looking at all the communications, not just email, but what about Slack? What about Jira? What about GitHub? What about all those messages? You can figure out what makes for an efficient process, what makes for an inefficient process, where are the bottlenecks, just like you did with cranberries, right? You can figure out where are the bottlenecks in the software development process, okay? And all this digital dust is being spit off. Every single employee is just spraying all this, and it's kind of like when you go to the hospital. They do the EKG. What happens to that data? You're in there for 4 days. They're tracking your EKG for 4 days. What happens to that data? Gone, typically. What happens to all this data? Gone, typically. Track it, record it, analyze it, improve your productivity. Intel, no, there we go. Okay, so what about these? So this is actually not Intel. This is a call center. If you want to improve productivity, why not run experiments? So a couple people I know did a couple experiments. Again, this is great because it's standardized work. And they asked a very simple question, which was, does the physical location of your job impact your productivity? Does where you sit impact your productivity? In other words, what if we could rearrange people and get more productivity out of them? How much would that cost? Nothing, right? Nothing. And so what they did is they said, let's just randomize. We'll have these people, we'll randomize them. Instead of letting them sit willy-nilly, we're going to actually decide where they sit. And what they were interested in was a very simple question. If you put productive people next to unproductive people, does this increase the average productivity or decrease the average productivity? Now, there's been a debate over this in the literature for like 50 years. Put the productive people out there and they will seed everybody else and inspire everybody else. The alternative view is take the unproductive people and quarantine them so they don't infect everybody else with their laziness, right? And so people would debate back and forth, but there was no evidence. Right? If you're a scientist, you say, and there was rats, let's say, you'd be like, let's do an experiment. So they did an experiment. Can anybody guess what the answer was? No, actually the opposite. If you put the productive people out there, distribute them around, and put them next to the unproductive people, they lift the productivity of the unproductive people. And how much we're talking about, let's see, productivity? We're talking about a 13% increase in productivity. Now, what do you have to do to get a 13% increase in productivity typically? A lot. Hire 13% more people, okay? And you get 13% more real estate. Okay, how much does this cost? Nothing. Okay, free productivity. Okay, here's another example based on this research around kind of vectors of transmission. I'll skip this, water cooler stuff. Coffee breaks. Should you have coffee breaks that are synchronized or asynchronized? So for these call center workers, you could either have each group have their coffee break together, or you could be like, you coffee break, then you, then you, then you, then you. Which one leads to more productivity? Together. Again, same amount of break time, but if you have everybody take the break at the same time, then instead of them just texting and doing Angry Birds, Words with Friends, or whatever the heck they do, they're like, yo, hey, I had this phone call. This person's a pain in the butt. Like, but I talked him off a cliff and got him to buy the product. How'd you do it? Oh, I did this. Boom, boom, boom. Great. Go back to work. Okay? 8% increase in productivity. Again, how do you know? Because you did a controlled experiment. You did an A/B test. Okay? So, A/B testing, which we've been doing in marketing for like 20 years, we're now doing in the world of HR. Right? We're now doing in the world of HR. So we're getting good quality inference about causation. Okay, so in the time we have left, I want to talk about, again, we don't have time to go through all this, but a big part of this course that I teach on the workplace is really about kind of workplace satisfaction, workplace happiness, workplace healthiness. And increasingly, when you're in a job market where it's really, really hard to attract and retain people, you have to think about, right, the spiritual, emotional, and intellectual side of what it means to work at a particular place, and the physical aspects of what it means to work in a particular place. So a former student of mine created this thing called Track Your Happiness, and it was really the first time anybody tried to measure what makes people happy or non-happy in real time. Okay? And then looked for relationships between happiness and productivity. And it turns out there is a relationship between happiness and productivity. Okay? When you're productive, you're happy. When you're happy, you're productive. You have a correlation. The question is, which way does it go? Okay? So some experimental evidence would be in order. Now we know engagement, we know happiness, we know these other terms that are thrown around are extremely important. Okay? Most American workers are what we call disengaged. They're apathetic, they don't really care, they're not happy, they don't feel fulfilled, they don't feel excited about their work. And again, it depends on the geography and so forth and the industry, but throughout industries, even in exciting places like San Francisco, we have disengaged employees. Now, there's a lot of reasons why we want kind of engagement or happiness. These are all some of the output variables that tend to correlate with this index. And a lot of it has to do with what's called burnout. Okay, so what is burnout? So burnout is kind of the opposite of engagement. There's actually a third thing, which is like, there's disengagement and there's active disengagement, right? So disengagement is just like, whatever. Active disengagement is, right, when bad things start to happen. Someone gets so frustrated and so upset with their workplace that they start to, right, emit toxic vibes to the people around them, okay? And again, you can think of it as the fault of the worker, or you can think of it as the fault of the workplace. Since you can't control the worker, you have to assume that it's the problem at the workplace. And so if you're not making efforts, a lot of self-help books will say, hey, here's how to make sure you don't get disgruntled at work, okay? But it's really about the workplace. And if you're in charge of a workplace as a founder, as an HR manager, it's up to you. When you see this, you don't say troublemaker, you say, what's the problem here? If the canaries in the coal mine are dying, you don't say, hey, let's get new canaries. Right? You say, what's going on here, right? What's going on in the mine, okay? And so this is actually a colleague in the psychology department, and she's the world's leading expert in burnout. We here at Berkeley have the world's leading expert in burnout, world's leading expert in workplace happiness, world's leading expert in sleep. I mean, we have some of the best resources around these topics here at Berkeley. And burnout is really a combination of a feeling of exhaustion, a feeling of cynicism, and a feeling of inefficacy. And it's not about overwork. This is the key thing. People think that burnout comes from overwork. It doesn't. If you love your work, you can work crazy hours. Okay? If you hate your work, even a small amount of work will destroy you. Okay? And so understanding where these things come from is important. So Jeff Pfeffer down at Stanford, he wrote this book called Dying for a Paycheck. And what he did is he went through and analyzed, right, the impact, economic and physical, on, right, bad workplace environments. Now, we're not talking about coal miners who get crushed in a landslide, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about people in office jobs that are experiencing stress which physiologically shortens their lifespan. Okay? And the number one thing is a lack of control. Right? Lack of control, a feeling that you don't have control of your workplace. Another big one is called low organizational justice, meaning a feeling that you are not being treated fairly. Right? You are not being treated the same as other employees. Okay? Again, this is something which the workplace, the employer has control over, and they are killing employees. Okay, why? Primarily because of stress. Okay, so this is Maslow, and he came up with this thing called the Maslow hierarchy of needs, and I find this a really interesting, a really valuable way to organize this part of my class, where I start with the aspirational and then move down to the more physiological. Okay, and they're all part of a continuum here. And we see that well-being, physiological and psychological, has dramatic effects on the workplace. So this is really what we want. This is the opposite of Maslow's. We want engaged, motivated, and happy. That's what we want. Now, happiness doesn't mean like, ooh, wow, let's all like hang out and party and hang out in the spa. I mean, people who work hard are happy if they're working right. And so, part of it is about work-life balance, and we all of us in the Bay Area know that this is something that we have to think about. But really, stress is a very real thing, and I could spend a lot of time talking about the science behind it. But fundamentally, the physiological impact of sustained stress, it will kill you. It will kill you. Not in the short run, but in the long run. And so there's lots of studies. Again, I could go on and on, where the one classic experiment is they would shoot cold virus up your nose. Okay, can you, these psychologists have a lot of fun, right? So what they'll do is they'll subject you to a whole bunch of stress, and then they'll squirt some cold virus up your nose. Or they'll just ask you, like, hey, how happy are you at your work? You're like, work sucks. And then they'll spray some cold virus up your nose. And the people who say, work sucks, and they spray the cold virus, they actually get the cold. And the people are like, oh, man, I love my life. Job's great. Squirt some cold virus up their nose, no cold. Right? Their immunological system is impaired by stressful experiences. Okay, and that's, of course, if you understand stress, you understand why it makes sense. Okay, and so with stress, cold risk goes up. Again, it's a controlled experiment. This is not an associational test. This is an actual experiment. Okay, chronic stress. Okay, again, so stress is not a bad thing. This is the key thing. Most people think, oh, stress, terrible thing. No. If you have no stress, then you don't get out of bed. Okay? You need some stress. You'd be like, all right, let's do it. Come on, let's get some stress. You need to be motivated. So there's an optimal amount of stress. Okay? If you're too unstressed, then that's when you need someone to kick your ass. If you are too stressed, then this is a big problem. So this is a famous relationship. Most people spend all their time focusing on this side, but you also have to focus on this side. So you need an environment that's stimulating. And this is why, when I teach, I go around and go like, because I'm trying to stress you out so you don't fall asleep. When you teach the evening people, right? How many of you are evening people? Okay, you wake up at 5 a.m., take the kids to school, go to work, you're hanging out in the cubicle at Intel all day, and then, you take the bus, and then you're here, and it's 9 o'clock, you've been up all day, you got 3 hours sleep. If you don't have a professor going, "Rah!" You're going to fall asleep, right? So you need stress. You just don't need too much of it. Okay? And so if you have the optimal amount of stress in your life, then you experience this thing called flow. Right? You experience this thing called flow, where you're challenged, right? It's not too easy, it's not too hard. You match your skills with your challenges. Okay? If you're overskilled for your task, then you're bored. If you're underskilled for the task, you experience anxiety. So video games are addictive because they capture that state of flow. What we want is we want to create a workplace environment that's equally addictive, right? People get in that flow and they stay there. They enjoy it. They're constantly challenged, never bored, but never over-challenged. Okay? Okay. And so, what are the kinds of things that can help you deal with stress? Remember, so it's not just that the stressful experience creates stress. Stressful experience can create stress unless you have buffers, unless you have protectors. What are some of the protectors? Social connections. Okay, studies show social connections will prolong your life. Loneliness is probably the biggest plague that we're experiencing, worse than opiates, worse than cancer here in our society today. In the workplace, you can actually alleviate that. One of the most important predictors of whether somebody's going to quit in their job is how many friends they have at work. Okay, you can actually adjust the workplace to stimulate more friendships, thereby gathering not only more retention, but also happier and healthier employees. Okay? So how do you encourage friendships in the workplace? Okay? People with more friends live longer. People with more family connections live longer. Okay? They've done experiments on monkeys where they disrupt their social patterns. They move them from monkey cage to monkey cage. And of course, guess what happens? They all die. Okay? So, people are switching jobs every 13 months. Oh, they got their Facebook friends, I guess. Okay. So, hugging. Well, this is before the Me Too, but hugging will prolong your life. It has to be someone that you want to hug you. It can't be someone that you don't want hugging you. But anyway, hugging will extend your life. Okay. All right. So this is a guy at Stanford, Robert Sapolsky. He's probably one of the world's leading experts on stress, and he studies baboons, as you can tell. You're like, I wonder why this guy's interested in baboons. Well, he's able to kind of slip in unnoticed into the community there. But, what he would do is, and you have to be able to slip in unnoticed, because what he's doing is he's actually taking blood samples and measuring their cortisol levels, right? So they got to like you to let you do that. And what he found was, who do you think's the most stressed baboon in the organization? The alpha or the beta? Like who within an organization, who's the most stressed person? CEO, CFO, whatever, all the way down, VP, product manager? Who's the least stressed? The CEO. Now we think, oh my gosh, that's a terrible job being a CEO. Oh man, he's got so many responsibilities and whatever. Guess what? Lowest stress. Same thing with the baboons. The more dominant you are, okay, the less stressed you are. And this is one of the things, so what people do, and baboons, in order to de-stress themselves, is they do things that assert or remind themselves of their status. Oftentimes what they'll do is they'll beat other people or abuse other people in order to reduce their stress symptoms. This is no joke. And so you have to be aware of this to understand what the root causes are. And so they've done a lot of studies on this, and they found that when you go to an organization like a government bureaucracy where you have very highly codified, stratified positions, you can track them longitudinally and look at their health outcomes. This is a famous Whitehall study, and what they found was that the lower you were in the organization, the more likely you were to die. Okay? The more negative adverse health outcomes you had. Okay, and again, this is not caused by the task. It's not caused by access to health care, because in England they all have the same crappy health care, right? Or good health care, depending on how you think of it. But it's status. Status alone. Low status kills you. Low status kills you. If you're in a workplace where people are continually reminded of their low status, they will be unhealthy, they will be unhappy, and they will die. Okay? And so anyway, lots and lots of studies, monkeys, okay, inequality, Russia. This is an economist at Cornell, and he actually found that you can compensate your workers either with cash or status. It's a trade-off. The lower status they are, the more you actually have to pay them for the same work in two organizations. Same work, same task. If it's higher status in one organization, lower status in the other, you have to pay higher wages in the other. Okay? Now, of course, some people think there's a fixed amount of status to go around in an organization. It's not true. Okay, you can make everybody a VP. No. There are ways that you can, right, give people status. Give them the ability, right, to get things done. If people feel like they can get things done, that's status. A feeling of control, a feeling of power, a feeling of choice. There's a famous experiment where they went into old age homes. And old age homes are these very regimented things. You sit down, you have dinner, the dinner's designed for you, whether you like it or not. And they said, let's just give these old people the ability to choose, like, what flavor of Jell-O they can eat for dinner, And of course, it all tastes the same, but they actually could be like, I want the cherry, I want the orange, I want the lime. Prolonged life expectancy, right? Again, control. Give people some control. Not only will they be more productive, but you can pay them less. This is Dr. Keltner. He's done a lot of work here at Berkeley on, like, status. Okay? And if you feel like you have no power, no efficacy, right, it activates a physiological stress response, which short-circuits your immune system and has all sorts of adverse effects. In fact, this is a study that one of my favorite studies, not because it's kind of mean, but it's one of my favorite. I like the results. 3 rats in cages, 3 mice in 3 cages. And they're getting electric shocks, okay? This one doesn't get any shocks. These 2 get shocks. They're painful shocks. This one is on a treadmill. And whenever he stops pedaling the treadmill, he gets a shock. Okay? This one gets a shock whenever this one stops treading on the treadmill. So this one has absolutely no idea why it's getting shocked. It's just hanging out, doing its treadmill. It's like, what's going on here? And so it's like, so it runs faster. Shock. Runs slower. Shock. Like, it has no idea. This one knows exactly why it's getting shocked. It's like, I took a rest, I got shocked, right? Which one do you think there's a difference in life expectancy? Yeah. In fact, these 2 more or less live the same amount. Like, the shocks don't kill you. As long as you know why you're getting shocked, it doesn't matter. This one, dead. Right? Stressed as hell, trying to figure out what's going on here, right? There's no connection between kind of input and output, between, work and reward. And it's doing its best. It's trying to do everything right, and it's just getting shocked, okay? Dead. Okay? So, these things, autonomy and mastery, this is not like soft, fluffy stuff. This is stuff that will kill you or make you live. It'll keep people working for you. It'll help them to be productive and healthy and happy. Okay? So again, working hard doesn't kill you. Working hard when you don't have any control kills you. Okay? So giving people control over their work is very important. Okay, so mindfulness meditation, this is a big movement that's happening in the workplace. Okay, companies like LinkedIn have chief meditation officer. A lot of this is about stress reduction. Okay, communication. I'm going to skip this. We're running out of time. And I want to just jump in and say a few things about the physical workspace. Because the physical workspace also has a huge impact on, right, your work experience, on attracting, retaining people, on getting productivity out of people. And so we have an architect in the room, right? So that's fantastic. Architect / MBA. There's only a couple of them in the universe, and we have one of them right here. Okay. Here's Intel for you. There we go. So when we go to that Maslow's hierarchy, there's actually the physiological experience that you have in the workplace. And it encompasses all of these things: air, water, nourishment, light, fitness, comfort, and mind. When you go to the workplace of today, it doesn't look anything like the workplace of yesterday. We see stuff like this. Okay? Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing compared to the offices of old? What do you think? Oh, come on, you guys are all MBAs. You know the answer is it depends. It depends. Okay, so for things like collaboration, actually this is really helpful. Right? So collaborative teams need to work together. For focused work, it's actually very difficult, as many of you know, because you can't concentrate with all this static. These spaces are enormously helpful when it comes to like brainstorming and innovating. And so a lot of offices are incorporating these. Okay, and so if you're going to have this, you got to have this. Right? So more and more offices are creating these kind of telephone booths, private spaces, because the type of work you do over the course of the day changes. So you need to change your workspace. What about transparency? So we all know that it's Mark Zuckerberg's out on the floor, everybody can see what he's doing, it's great, transparent, and so forth. But transparency can be very stressful. So again, one of the more famous studies in psychology literature is this thing where they had these cockroaches. And the cockroaches were trying to navigate this maze. And in one treatment, they did it without any observers. And in the other, they had these other cockroaches watching them. Okay? Now, sometimes they had simple mazes, sometimes they had more complex mazes. Now, where do you think the roaches did best? When they were being watched or when they were, by themselves? What? Being well, because they were Olympic, sprinters. Yeah, you got to have your fans out there. Yeah, go do it. Yeah. I don't know how the roaches do that. Flapping their fingers. I don't know. Well, it turns out when the task is really easy, being observed actually, it doesn't harm you. It actually, sometimes even helps you. When the task is complex and requires, concentrating that little baby roach brain, being observed actually detracts from performance because, again, it activates stress. Right? So when you're in a highly stressed environment, you got a lion chasing you and you're stressed out. Well, you know what? You can run like hell. And the fact that you're stressed out does not impair your ability to run. But if the lion is chasing you and you got a combination lock you got to open in order to get away from the lion, you're meat. Because that stress is going to impair your cognitive ability. Okay? So depending on the task, turning a crank, having a foreman looking over you is probably going to help you. If you're trying to write code and you've got someone leaning over your shoulder, other people observing, it may actually impair. Okay? So I'll give you just a couple more examples. When you go to a hotel, where do you feel safer? Do you feel safer with a bed like this or a bed like that? Two, you sleep actually better in this environment. Why? I mean, if you're in a hotel, a typical Hyatt, Marriott in a civilized country, is somebody going to jump you in the middle of the night? No. But our wiring was created in a world, right, where, these sorts of things happened. And we can't just assume that physiology has disappeared. And so if you're sitting in an open office and you're typing at your desk and you've got people walking behind you all the time, it actually, without you even realizing it, activates your stress response. Now, granted, the worst thing could happen is your office worker might elbow you in the head or do this behind your head or whatever. They're not going to eat you. But your body doesn't know that, okay? And so, the physical space that you have can increase or decrease your stress and thereby impact your productivity. And there's been A/B tests on this. Okay, lots of studies show that noise impacts your productivity, your health, your happiness, your ability to concentrate. There's a famous study of this high-rise in New York City, and the families were assigned to the high-rise randomly, and the street noise decreased as you went higher in the building. And they looked at the standardized test scores and the grades of the students in this building, and they got better and better as they went higher and higher in the building. Okay? People in the path of an airplane, they die young because of the noise. Okay? So offices have to think about noise. Noise can actually impact health, happiness, productivity. Okay? Okay. So, this is our old office. This is the way offices used to be, right? The old open office. This is kind of newer offices where people can kind of, you don't give up the value of open office, but you introduce the possibility of getting away from the office. Okay? So there's lots of new, cool, interesting, innovative things, and there's lots of science behind office design. And when you're paying someone a couple $100,000 a year to write code or to sell stuff, and you don't take seriously things that can impact productivity, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10%, increase retention by 1, 2, 3, 5, 10%, all through spending a tiny amount of money, really, then you're doing so at your peril. Okay? Okay, lots of other cool stuff. What's called biophilia, which is sort of, exposing people to nature. They've done A/B tests on hospital beds. You actually demand more opiates and stay in the hospital longer if you're looking out on a brick wall as opposed to looking out on trees. Even pictures of trees can impact your health. Okay? Again, this is not, conjecture. This is actually based on, controlled experiments. Okay, and so that's why UCSF, every window has a tree outside it. Okay? Reduces hospital stays. What's a hospital stay? $3,000 a day, $4,000 a day? How much does a tree cost? Not much. So you start seeing this stuff everywhere. Okay, temperature, chemicals, mold, right? Air quality. Sitting, I won't even talk about sitting. Sitting is the new smoking, right? Okay, so you see these new kinds of desks. Exercise will help you live longer, help you think better, stave off Alzheimer's, help you to concentrate and focus. And so employers are taking this seriously. Employers are providing exercise facilities, not just for fun, but because it enhances productivity. Okay? You can build this into your space. Don't have people take elevators. Have them take stairs. Right? And you can track it. Hydration. There are studies that show that if you're thirsty, you're unproductive. If you're thirsty, you are grumpy. If you're hungry, you will actually kill people. Okay? Famous studies on food. I won't get into it. Okay, so you make sure your people are well fed. Famous study on negotiations. You get much more likely to have a successful negotiation outcome if there's food during the negotiation. Okay, and then sleep. I think the last things I'll mention are sleep. We're living in a crisis of sleep crisis, right? Where people are not sleeping enough, and that's because we're Americans. Americans are like sleep when you're dead. China's even worse. 9-9-6. Right? 9 a.m., 9 p.m., 6 days, sleep when you're dead, right? Okay, now the problem with that is that sleep deprivation has such dramatic impacts on your cognition, on your ability to remember things, your ability to learn. If you go without sleep, it's worse than being drunk in terms of your ability to operate a motor vehicle. Okay? Reduces your memory, makes you grumpy, messes up your immune system, your genetics. And I'll just give you this. This is for kids going to school at 7 a.m. Okay, if you can delay the onset of the school time, you can reduce accidents. You can increase standardized test scores. Very, very simple interventions. There's a lot of studies. Does that tell you enough studies? A lot of studies here. Okay. So. In hospitals, this is really before you check into a hospital. Ask them what their resident sleeping schedule is. Okay, why? Because if they have a normal sleeping schedule, again, same amount of work, but a normal sleeping schedule, look at the number of errors. The errors are cut in half for serious medical errors. These are like fatal medical errors. Okay, medication errors, diagnostic errors, 800 times bigger when people are sleep deprived. You go in there and with an infection in your leg, and they're like, yeah, cancer, whatever. I mean, it's okay. And these are natural experiments. We can look at people based on their time zone, and we can see differences at this line. If we just look at this boundary along the time zone, and we just compare people in the counties on the left and the counties on the right, we see productivity differences, health outcome differences, and income differences. It's about a 3% income differential. People on this side of the line versus that side of the line, because they get more sleep. Okay? So, take a nap. Create a nap room. My office mate sometimes will open the door and he'll slam into his sleeping body because he's sleeping under his desk. Okay? Give people nap rooms. Okay, this is becoming increasingly popular in some Silicon Valley companies. Okay, I won't talk about lighting, but lighting is also really interesting. And so I just want to conclude by saying, look, there is a new workforce science out there. There is a new scientific management out there that's not focused on people who are cranking things and assembling things, making cranberries, right? There is a new workforce science that applies to us, that applies to people in the ideas economy, people who are using their brains for a living, right? People who are operating in these offices, you know, writing code, managing people, selling stuff, managing products. Okay, and if you, as a C-level person or a manager, if you are not aware of this and you are not pressuring your organization to start taking this stuff seriously, right, then you will fail to attract the best people, fail to retain the best people, fail to get the most out of your people. And since people represent your most valuable asset, since people represent your comparative advantage, your competitive advantage in today's marketplace, then you are throwing away, right, the most valuable thing you have in your company. So take workplace analytics seriously, take HR analytics seriously, take people operations seriously, and also take all of the things that we've learned about workplace design seriously. This is not an integrated science. It's architects, public health, psychologists. It will be a science. It'll be something I think that will be taught in every business school going forward. Right now it's something that's only taught in a few places, one of which is here at the Haas School. So thanks for all coming back, getting your little dose of lifelong learning, and I hope to stay in touch, connect on LinkedIn if you haven't already.